And I don't think there's a direct one-to-one comparison for Bitcoin spam to anything else in the world because there's really nothing else like Bitcoin. So you can't really directly compare it to email spam. Mail spam, physical mail spam, maybe, but it's still like not perfectly a one-to-one example. I believe there's a simpler way to define spam, which is it is not an organic Bitcoin transaction. It is trying to do something else. Like if you think about what a Bitcoin transaction is, yes, it is data, but it is Bitcoin's native data, which is Bitcoin.
As Bitcoin edges closer to mainstream adoption, few voices are as bold or as critical of its inner workings as Samson Mow. Samson Mow, CEO of January 3rd and a leading advocate for Bitcoin nation-state adoption, has long maintained that Bitcoin could reach $1 million within the next decade. Known for his outspoken views, Mow has recently turned his attention to Bitcoin development culture, raising concerns about risks of groupthink within influential organizations like Chaincode Labs. While stressing that he trusts the ethics of key figures such as Alex, he warns that when too many developers work closely together, an echo chamber effect can emerge, one that may unintentionally skew decision-making. Mow argues that Bitcoin developers must better appreciate psychology and emotional intelligence when making changes to the protocol. Since Bitcoin is money, not merely data, altering long-standing software defaults, such as filters or standardness rules, can feel like a nerf to long-term users. This dynamic often creates backlash, raising a critical question. Is Bitcoin Core being built for a small group of technical insiders or for the broader community of global node operators? On the issue of spam, Mow rejects the idea that paying fees automatically legitimizes transactions. Instead, he distinguishes between organic Bitcoin transfers and external protocols like Ordinals or inscriptions, which he considers non-native and spam-like. While Bitcoin's speed and low cost remain its biggest draws, volatility and the absence of central oversight continue to fuel debate. We're still early in the game. Bitcoin's biggest breakout is still on the horizon. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next major move.
I don't think it's the case. So I've known Alex for a long time, and during the block size wars, we were fighting on the same side. I don't believe that chain code as a vehicle is doing anything bad, but I believe there might be some groupthink echo chamber that's being built out internally because they do have a lot of developers that are working in the same office, thinking the same thing. And, that the effect that gives you is really that groupthink. And that is the danger, I would say. There's accusations that someone donated to Chaincode to influence. I don't believe those accusations. And I don't have any doubt on Alex's morality and ethics. But I think it's often blurred because of the behavior of some of the developers they hire. But I believe it would be the same as at Blockstream. There is really a lot of freedom given to the developers, and they can basically do what they want. I don't think Alex is saying, push for this change or do something. That's kind of not the way that Chaincode works, nor Blockstream. And that's unfortunate because the developers are behaving in a kind of unprofessional way, and they're not really, acting like you would expect a steward of the Bitcoin protocol to act, especially when there's a lot of outcry about what they're doing and the changes they're making. And I would say that has more to do with understanding psychology and EQ than anything else. Like, Bitcoin is money. And I think some people are debating, like, do the developers know that Bitcoin is money? Because they seem to think it's data or data storage. And some developers have said the same thing, like Bitcoin is the data storage and all data on Bitcoin is the same. But, it's definitely expected that people will get angry if you modify the software that they've been using for a very long time. And a lot of the people working on Bitcoin that are pushing for these changes, or are even maintainers now, are basically new to the space. And there's like Bitcoin plebs and OGs that have been running Bitcoin Core since, 15 years ago, right? Like, I've been running Core since I started in Bitcoin. So I think I'm a Bitcoin user. And it's just kind of frustrating, I think, when you see people changing something, even if it's a default, even if it's a weak counter to spam, which is an argument that's thrown out there. But the crux of it is like, Bitcoin node software is sort of synonymous with Bitcoin. And to change something that belongs to someone else is sort of a no-no, right? In game development, we have to deal with this a lot. It's basically when you want to nerf something, you have to think very carefully about nerfing it. And you could say removing some of these filters or defaults or standardness rules is the same as nerfing. Even if it's the right thing to do, just psychologically taking something away from somebody will create this, immune reaction from the people running the software. And I don't think that the developers really understood that. Or maybe they do understand it and they just don't care about it. But then that begets the question again of who are they developing the software for? Is it for very highly technical people, or is it people running the nodes? And then that led to another big wave of gaslighting and like core developers and core supporters saying, it doesn't really matter if you run a node, which runs counter to Bitcoin itself. So it's just a really messy situation that we're in. And I don't think there's a direct one-to-one comparison for Bitcoin spam to anything else in the world because there's really nothing else like Bitcoin. So you can't really directly compare it to email spam. Mail spam, physical mail spam, maybe, but it's still not perfectly a one-to-one example. But I would say, yes, there is spam. And this is a whole other dimension to the whole debate, which is some core supporters are saying there's no such thing as spam because the spammers paid a fee. But going back to the imperfect example, the guy that's spamming your email also paid for his internet connection. That doesn't necessarily mean that you want to get that, right? But I believe there's a simpler way to define spam, which is it is not an organic Bitcoin transaction. It is trying to do something else. If you think about what a Bitcoin transaction is, yes, it is data, but it is Bitcoin's native data, which is Bitcoin. So if you're sending someone Bitcoin, that's not spam because that's the native data of the network. But a lot of this spam that we're encountering now is like ordinals and other types of things that are kind of trying to put data or images embedded into Bitcoin because they're trying to piggyback on Bitcoin's immutability. So I think you can sort of make that delineation and say, this is spam, this is not spam, because these are Bitcoin transactions, people using the software to do what it originally did out of the box. It didn't out of the box let you send ordinals, right? Ordinals is actually a separate protocol completely. It's got its own node software. All it does is point to Bitcoin and say, we think that this is an ordinal, and you can decode it and it looks like a picture.
Bitcoin's growth into a trillion-dollar market has brought unprecedented scrutiny, not just from regulators, but from within its own development community. Samson Mow believes one of the deepest sources of tension in Bitcoin development lies in determining whose opinions truly count. He recalls that the rift with Bitcoin Core traces back to debates over OP_return and the way discussions were handled on GitHub, where some participants were blocked or banned under accusations of brigading. While developers often claim to encourage open dialogue, Mow argues that many decisions appear to be predetermined, eroding trust and fueling conspiracy theories. For him, the result has been an echo chamber effect, where changes are made behind the scenes rather than through genuine community consensus. At the center of this debate is the modification of defaults, such as raising the OP_return limit from 83 bytes to far larger values. To many users, these adjustments seem unnecessary and suspicious, especially when they appear to accommodate outside companies like Citria, which is building a Layer 2 solution and requires greater data capacity. Mow warns that tailoring Bitcoin Core to external parties risks undermining the protocol's neutrality. Even if OP_return is technically superior, he notes that economic realities push users toward cheaper methods like UTXOs. Since Bitcoin's launch in 2009, cryptocurrencies have grown into a trillion-dollar industry, but regulatory oversight and questions of developer influence continue to shape its future. Let's get back to the interview.
Well, you have all of that in the mix, and I think that's kind of one of the drivers of the issue, which is how do you determine whose opinions are valid? So if you go back in time to the origin of the whole shifting away from core, it was over op_return. And the fact that they were blocking people or banning them from GitHub because they were saying we're being brigaded. and they blocked Luke at some point, Mechanic at some point, and there's a lot of dismissal about people's feedback. And they're saying we want discussion, but then they don't really want discussion, and it's more like it's already decided. And that kind of brings us down the rabbit hole to another level, which is, are developers working at companies kind of in an echo chamber of their own and sort of pre-deciding what changes are good and what changes should make it in, and then kind of going through the motions of discussing in public. Because there's a lot of weird stuff that happened back then. Like they locked the thread and unlocked it so that someone could hack it, and then locked it again to kind of manufacture consent or agreement. But there was just a lot of stuff like that, and it's never apparent who was responsible for these kind of antics, and if anything was done about it. It's just kind of like things happen and nobody's really responsible, and then things continue to happen. So this is why I believe there's sort of a shattering in trust of core developers, and it's understandable that you see a lot of conspiracy theories come up. And it's not really helped either by how a lot of the core developers are behaving. Now, I'm not saying like the not side are angels, but there are people doing and saying bad things on both sides that I think should be de-escalated and toned down because it's not helpful. But definitely, I would say it's instigated on the core developer side when you go back in time and you look at the origin of the whole schism. So it comes down to removing defaults and removing the ability for people to change the defaults, or at least change them easily. So it's data carrier and the operaturn limit, which is being lifted from 83 bytes to the maximum, which is like 10,000 bytes or something like that. So, it's basically core developers trying to change something, which I think people don't want them to change. And it's led to this whole discussion of, should core developers listen to people? Because then it's like they're capitulating to peer pressure or pressure from external sources. But then on the flip side of that, you have people questioning, like, why are they initiating this change in the first place? And is it because they were bribed, or there's money involved, or something like that, or some other perverse incentives? Like, I don't know, they're in league with the people trying to spam the chain. And then you get the whole other rabbit hole of like, is there such thing as spam too, which is another thing. Well, I mean, it's not sure who would want to use operaturn right now. So the issue is that a company called Citrea that's building a layer 2 is using UTXOs and tiny UTXOs to store data instead of operaturn, because they're saying the operaturn limit is too constraining and they need 160 bytes or something like that. So Bitcoin core developers kind of are changing default settings to accommodate them, which I think is another issue, because it's what we call in game development, it's a slippery slope. Once you start changing something for a company, then you start changing more things for other companies. So that you can see like both sides of the coin here. The users are saying, don't change it. And people are congratulating the devs for staying the course and changing it. But at the same time, they're changing it because someone else asked for a change too. And there's a video of Antoine Poinsot saying, like, I was talking to this Citrea developer and he needed this. And I thought, well, why don't we just change it? And that's what he is saying on camera, not what anyone else is saying. It's not an accusation, but it is a fact. Like, there are changes being done to accommodate external parties, external protocols to Bitcoin itself. And I don't think that's really a good thing. But going back to your main point, who's using it? Nobody's really using it at this point, because operaturn is 4 times more expensive than using data in UTXOs. So it's really not a good argument. And I think a lot of people are seeing through that. Like, yes, in theory, it'd be good if everyone used operaturn because it can be pruned, but will they use it? And I don't know. I mean, you shouldn't really trust that they're going to change their protocol and use something that's more expensive, right? You should expect people will trend to the cheapest method of doing whatever they're trying to do. But the question it really begets is, should core developers be changing anything for an external party?
Right. So maybe who's Chaincode?
Chaincode is a private company that is funding a lot of Bitcoin development. So it's started by Alex Morkos and Suhas, and they're basically funding it with their own money, I believe. And it was formed, I'm not sure, but it was probably around the time of Blockstream. But back in like 2016, 17 is really mainly Blockstream, MIT, and Chaincode that was funding Bitcoin development.
Bitcoin's retreat below $113,000 underscores the delicate balance between short-term market pressures and the long-term vision of decentralized money. Its true strength has always been neutrality, free from external control and political influence. Yet, as development debates grow more complex, the risk emerges that protocol changes driven by narrow interests could weaken this foundation. For Bitcoin to remain the backbone of a trillion-dollar digital economy, innovation must be paired with broad consensus and unwavering decentralization. Ultimately, its future will depend on preserving these principles to secure its role as global, trustless money in an increasingly uncertain financial landscape. Will Bitcoin's long-term value be secured by preserving decentralization, or will developer-driven changes risk undermining its role as global money? Crypto never sleeps. Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this with your circle, and hit subscribe with notifications to ride the next search.